Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with me, Hema Lomax and Lisa Fine. Today's episode is a roundtable session with Ellen Hunt joining the discussion, along with our esteemed guests, Barbara Petitti, who is Alstom's Director of Ethics and Compliance Training, Communications and Culture, and Allison Riter, Vice President and Associate General Counsel, Compliance Litigation. Our roundtable topic today is the Compliance Playbook, Best Practices for M&A Success. Both of our guests have had extensive experience in corporate transactions, some that have gone well with successful ethics and compliance integration, nothing but smooth sailing, and others that have had some bumps in the road. We are honoured to have these two experts here to discuss this important topic, and I'll let them tell you more about their roles and experience. So Barbara, welcome. Let's start with you, if we may. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Hema. Yes, so I'm Barbara Petitti. I'm currently a compliance officer at Alstom. Alstom is a leader in global transportation. We are headquartered in France. We operate in about 63 countries around the world with 80,000 employees. And I have been involved in a couple of M&A transactions, both in the acquiring phase and also as the acquired organization. So I've seen it from both sides.
Lovely. Thank you so much for joining us. Alison, may I turn to you to share a bit about yourself, please?
Yes, of course. My name is Allison Riter. I work at nVent, leading our compliance program and teams. nVent is a global electrical company, so we operate in 35 different countries. We have about 10,000 employees and very busy in terms of acquisitions. So since I've been a part of nVent, we have been quite active. About seven companies we've acquired since I've been there. Our largest one was in 2023. That was $1.1 billion. So all of our companies that we're acquiring are really looking to enhance our capabilities in electrical connection and protection solutions.
Very nice. Welcome. Over to you, Ellen.
Thank you both, Allison and Barbara, for being with us today. It seems to me when you look at M&A, it's like one of those elements like monitoring and auditing that just doesn't get as much of attention. Even companies that have world-class programs sometimes don't include compliance as part of the corporate transaction playbook. I'm kind of wondering why that is. And so when we kind of think about that, let's talk a little bit at the very beginning. How come the compliance team isn't part of the due diligence?
Ellen, that's such a good question. So let me ask, why do you think that the ethics compliance team is not often let under the tent and made part of that due diligence program? Alison, let's turn to you for that one.
Yeah, sure. I think that's an interesting question. I've been quite lucky because at nVent, we are involved very early on in due diligence, in integration. So when I think about that, I think back maybe on some history and some of my previous roles where we weren't involved. And it really, for me, was more about education and educating the business about why we need to be involved and what are the benefits for including. And sometimes it's just helpful to even talk through what are the risks of not including, right? That maybe speaks a bit more to the reason why.
And what tips would you offer to demonstrate the value of including ethics and compliance in the process then?
Yeah. So for me, it's really about building those relationships. So nVent is pretty newer. So we're about 7 years old. And so when I came to nVent, knowing like my history of not maybe being involved, I started to build relationships with the M&A teams, helping them understand why the ethics and compliance team could help the overall deal, right? How could we add value? Helping them understand that what we can do is maybe uncover some issues, some red flags that we'd want to get ahead of. And so helping them see that value was really beneficial to then when we talk about our corporate playbooks, we are right there as one of the head and key functions. And so that's wonderful. But that obviously has taken time and we've built that over a number of years.
Yes, that planting the seed of the relationships can be really powerful. But I also think, at least with an M&A, you've got the valuation coming. So there's a real urgent consequence of not bringing the team in. Barbara, what's your idea on that? How have you helped get ethics and compliance under the tent?
Similar to Allison, we have a process that we get involved early as well. But I have seen where E&C is not brought in early enough. And sometimes I think that's just a lack of coordination between functions where M&A is much more of a pure legal. That's a responsibility that falls, more strictly under legal. And their perspective many times is on defending rather than preventing. So it's a different mindset. And as Allison said, it's important that communication, building those relationships kind of reinforcing the message that the earlier we find some of these issues, the better it will be down the road, because the longer it takes, the harder it is to sometimes remedy things and really fix. So that communicate early, just really stress that we need to be involved, we need to understand. And there's also just this overall sensitivity around a transaction that is closely held, only a few people know about it. They want to really protect that sensitivity.
How to be part of the inner circle. Ellen, over to you.
Yeah, excellent points and things we need to think about. And I think we all kind of know those obvious red flags, right? They won't produce documents, or family and friends are the vendors and the supply. There's unexplained expenses, some of those things. But I think one of the things that having the E&C team involved earlier is we see some other kinds of red flags, right? Maybe related to culture or other things. And Barbara, I just ask you, do you have a cheat sheet or a punch list of things that you look for when you are a part of the team?
We don't have a cheat sheet per se, but what we do is we use the structure of our program. We use all the different processes. We go through our existing processes and instructions and look at what are the things we would focus on in our normal day-to-day in compliance, and look at those things. And then we also will look at the regional issues, whether the risk is increased by the market being somewhere where we know there's higher risk. And then understanding the organization of the acquired company can be a challenge, because getting that information and really understanding. So then looking at things like delegation of authority. Are those policies enforced consistently? Are different policies applied differently or implemented differently in different places or different levels of the organization? Things like that. So those kinds of sort of subtle inconsistencies. And yeah, looking at head from top to bottom, our existing program and applying it to the acquired company.
Great tips. Thank you. Allison, do you have kind of your own little red flag list that you got that you keep your eyes out for as you go through the process?
We don't have a necessarily a cheat sheet, but we definitely know what red flags to look for. But I think one interesting piece and one question I was recently asked by our business is, what are like some things that maybe aren't bright red that we should even care about? And so I was thinking about it, and some of the things that I shared with them were just looking at if your target has maybe more ad hoc processes, or everyone does their own thing, that can suggest that things truly aren't enforced. Or one I saw more recently was around, there's a lot of conversation about that's what we do, or that's our verbal agreement, is kind of how it was described versus being written down. And to me, that could be some control weaknesses. So seeing some things that aren't bright red, maybe are pink, are things that I'd like to just check in on to help us get ahead. Like another one I thought was really interesting was around maybe you're receiving all the documents when you're looking at the target and they have policies or they have a code, but when you talk to employees, they don't know about them. That's just another interesting piece just to watch out for. Again, not showstoppers by any means, but good to know as you get ready, right, to close the deal.
Absolutely. And that all kind of leads into kind of risk assessments and how and when they get done.
It's one of my favorite topics, risk assessments. I think it's really an art, not just a science, and one of the most important things we can do when we're acquiring a company. So with compliance risk assessments, what's the best way to assess the compliance risk of the target? Allison, maybe you can share with us, when's the best time to complete a risk assessment and how do you do that?
Yeah, we do it in different ways depending on the target, but more often than not, we're never going to be able to do the risk assessment ahead of time. But what we will typically do is maybe more of a preliminary screening, right? Look at our top risks, maybe like more higher risk customers or vendors, do some initial screenings. But then when we close, a part of our playbook, every time we acquire a company, we're doing a risk assessment, and it's worked really well for us. We engage a same provider each time, that really understands us and knows our business, and they help us check, are there any gaps that we missed maybe in our due diligence? Help us truly look at the different policies or practices that are in place and prepare for our integration, which for us typically does last about a year. So for us, risk assessment happens right after we close. and it will be tailored to the target. It'll be tailored to the risk, but it always happens for us.
And it's so smart of you to mention integration, because integration should be a North Star here. It's something at the end, this is going to be one company. You've got to think about doing the risk assessment that fits for both. But
Yeah.
Barbara, I wanted to ask you, it's not always the case that you're acquiring a company that is in the same industry or the same line of
Mhm.
business. And so it's one thing to bring your best practices from one to integrate to another, but how do you manage that when you're crossing industries with acquisition?
That is such a good question. And it requires a lot of learning. You really have to educate yourself about that industry. You can't just assume that the risks will be the same as your current industry. So there's a lot of gathering that information, really trying to understand this new industry before you can go in and dive into a risk assessment. We developed a tool that we used on a recent acquisition that worked quite well. It was kind of a risk ranking. We took a scorecard that we use in when we're evaluating the risk of a project, right? We're looking at a tender. We have a scorecard, and we made a similar list, and then we were able to rank. Did this involve third parties? We looked at certain projects. Did it involve, were there joint ventures? What was the level of interaction with the customer? Things like that. And then adding in the region. And we ended up kind of having a score to start with so that then we could put different parts of the review in different buckets. And we ended up doing kind of a high risk, a medium risk, and a lower risk. And just to help us figure out how to approach evaluating the risk, because it's such a huge task. So we broke it down that way, and it was helpful. But there's a lot of learning.
So much learning, and it's very smart. I love the idea of the scoring, and it's very difficult, isn't it, really, to think about the scoring and the weighting. So again, back to the art, not a science, but really helpful tips there.
I think also one of the things that is always a bit of a challenge is what are those benchmarks or those key decisions for integration? Sometimes you're buying a company that's very different than your core business. It's really a separate line of business. Its culture may be very different. Maybe it's more like a startup rather than a traditional company. And you've got to think about two codes of conduct, two sets of policies, one set of policies. What is it that really is going to work? Is it going to be a federated model with corporate compliance oversight? Or is it really going to be, hey, you've been acquired and this is the way it is? It's our code, it's our program, it's our policies, and sorry if that doesn't really work with you. And then sometimes you get into some real issues of equity and fairness, right? Somebody goes, I used to be able to accept a gift for $100, now it's only for 50. And how do you explain, right? When you have kind of this separate but equal, right? They can do it, but we can't, and those things. So just talk to us a little bit, Allison, about what kind of decisions do you think about, and what kind of models have you used as you think about that 1 year integration plan?
Yeah. Okay. No, great. Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, what we'll always do is we'll pull out our integration playbook, but we know it's never going to be the same, right? Because every acquisition is different. And we're not just integrating compliance, right? We're integrating all the different functions. Everyone has things that they want to do. So I would say when we're looking at integration, we're going to look at our risk assessment because that's always our step one. It helps to map out what we need to do because we got to think about maybe regulatory landscape or current state, like you said, of the program or lack thereof, right? But then do we take into considerations like the culture, where they're at? Are they ready? And work with HR because you might need to go slower than you'd like to, just based on the kind of the new employees and new companies' readiness to change. And then the other piece when you're thinking about our integration plan that I think is really important is just about the resources you have to support, because you can't really do part way, right? You have to really have team members that are ready to support because it is a really big job. So we look at all those kind of different factors to then map out. Ideally, it's a year, right, with all of these different steps, but it can really depend on how big the acquisition is or how ready they are for change.
I love that comment about leveraging what's already there. Sometimes you're going in and what you're bringing as the acquirer is the structure and the compliance program because they didn't have one. And so sometimes they're like, great, now I have some clarity about the rules. And sometimes it's okay, you're gonna have to change to a different structure. And how do you make deal maybe a little bit with that change fatigue. Barbara, you've had many different kinds of acquisitions and or experiences on both sides, acquiring and being acquired. What do you think about when you think about, okay, how do you know if integration worked? Do you have metrics or tools to say this was successful, it wasn't successful?
So it's such a good question. We used many of our existing metrics to go ahead and look at how the integration was going. So one of the initial indicators, of course, was our hotline data. We saw pretty much a doubling of the volume, right? And the company that was acquired was the same size as ours. So our volume doubled, which was consistent with the population. So we thought, okay, that's a good indicator. People are telling us things. And then looking at other measurements, we did a survey and we evaluated those results to try and see where there were areas where maybe integration wasn't as effective as we would have liked. And it's a challenge because whenever you're melding these two organizations, there's also that element of the people thing. And there's uncertainty and people can be somewhat nervous. And so trying to get the real information and what people are really thinking about the integration is very challenging. Yeah, so we used a lot of our existing tools around that. We really focused a lot on training. One of the early things that we did is we got everyone trained on all the existing E&C classes and also did assessments on what people thought of the training. We got a lot of feedback. But yeah, trying to measure that effectiveness is tough with an integration.
And it's tough with a regular program too.
Yes.
Still all struggling with what is an effective compliance program and what does it really tell us? What levers and what data can we utilize? But I always also think about sometimes the culture clash.
Yes, and that's on my mind too, because there's a lot of work as it is to integrate the systems and the different functions, but really you are. And if it's just it may be two cultures, it may be lots of microcultures that need to come together. And so I have some questions around that for Barbara and Allison. We've talked about successes and what we can do to be successful, but what barriers have you seen when it comes to compliance integration? Allison, how would you overcome them to successfully integrate the compliance program if there's two different types of cultures?
Yeah. So I guess, Hema, one thing that comes to mind and that we talked about, I think we touched on at least already, is the resistance to change, right? Because the employees they're used to a certain way of doing things and they don't understand why does the gift entertainment policy have to change, or this is how we've always done it. And so one way that we've done it at nVent, or at least kind of help us kind of overcome that resistance, is to ask our business leaders to support. So I think we can, from a compliance perspective, share and help them understand the benefit. But when they can hear it from their leaders as well, really goes a long way of just helping to understand and taking the time to communicate and just not expecting that it's going to happen overnight, but using HR and using those business leaders to support.
It's so important to get the tone at the top right at that moment. I agree. Barbara, I was thinking about what Ellen said about bringing together two entities where, for example, there might be different numbers of policies or different types of policies. I worked at Disney just at the time when they were bringing on all the Fox companies. And I think the Fox companies had a number of policies in the hundreds and Disney had 7 or 8. And it was very difficult. Ellen mentioned, do we sometimes just say, hey, we're the new company now, follow along? How does that work for you? What have you seen in terms of strategies that come up because of the merger and acquisition that could impact the culture quite negatively? What barriers have you got there?
We tried to adopt a collaborative approach where it was an opportunity for us to look at our existing program. And even though we largely took the acquired company and applied our processes, we also were open to adopting some of the things that they were using in their E&C program. And I think that went a long way to saying, look, you guys, you did many things right. And we learned from that. And we used it as an opportunity to strengthen some areas of our own program because there is this sense of unfairness that people are coming into a new organization and they're just being told, this is it. If you don't like it, tough. And that's not going to help integrate those new people. But yeah, being open to changing some existing things, I think is good, and trying to be open to having those discussions and also Communication is key. We say that often, but explaining some context about why certain processes had to change. In my experience, having acquired a company with a less mature compliance program, that made it a little bit easier because we had more experience in implementing some processes. But still, there's always going to be some resistance.
Yeah, no, I agree. And back to Alison's point about change management, it's very difficult to manage the change and people's expectations. I think that's always the case, but even more so when the industries are different or it's very difficult for the employees to understand the purpose of the integration. So what have you done in terms of trying to share or communicate, to your point, the strategic value of the acquisition to your employees as part of this culture bonding, should we say, instead of clash? Barbara, I'll stick with you for that on that. What tips have you?
That's such a great question. In my experience, when you're acquiring another organization, you're not just getting people. People are a big asset, but you're also getting technology, you're getting experience, you're getting all this knowledge. And the two companies coming together have the opportunity to be much, much stronger and operate more efficiently, more effectively, and be more competitive. And I think that's the message to send, that these two individual companies come together and have the opportunity to be much stronger in the marketplace and more successful.
Yeah, that's so insightful. Alison, I'm thinking the only other barrier I've got in mind when it comes to bringing these cultures together is with an acquisition, there may be a fear of job insecurity on the part of the people that are being brought over. And of course, that can get in the way as well of the culture bonding. So has that been an issue for you in terms of people having that fear, at least, even if it's not founded? And how do you handle that if you've got that incoming insecurity?
I have definitely seen that just because I'm on the teams, but HR is something that comes up right away in terms of just early communication, because we know that's just the fear from the beginning. So I know HR brings that up, communicates to the teams right away. And I think that's the most important part is open communication to understand where we're going and what does that future look like for those employees.
And I know you've shared with us in preparation some past examples of mismatches, ill-fated matches in history. So I'd love you to comment on those.
Yeah, the Time Warner acquisition of AOL has been dubbed as the poster child of the most ill-fated marriage ever. And Mondelez's acquisition of Cadbury, which they actually did turn around eventually, but it was described as nothing but heartburn. You think about that, and some of that is, of course, that resistance to change, the resentment that the rules have changed, how we always did it isn't the same. And it makes me kind of think about where we are today and how much change we're seeing on a daily basis from a regulatory and enforcement front. I think there's kind of a heightened anxiety anyway. Right? Today, we thought maybe these were our biggest risks, and tomorrow there's something else because there's been a change, maybe in enforcement policy or tariffs, what tariffs are doing for folks and stuff like that. So kind of broadening the question out. And when you think about your compliance program as a whole, in addition to any companies you might be working with on bringing into the family, how are you dealing with the sifting sand, so to speak? And today it was this, tomorrow it's that. Are you kind of all steam ahead, or are you being cautious and reevaluating it? Just kind of thinking about your program as a whole. I'll start with you, Allison.
You know what that brings up for me is just we're going to look at each acquisition a little different, depending on what's changing out there with the regulatory landscape, right? I probably am going to have a lot more questions on tariffs this next time around, right? Or HTS codes and country of origin, maybe than I would before. So I think it's just all about where you're at in the world and what's top of mind for the business. So you can evolve and you can update your due diligence questionnaire and the questions you're asking as you're looking at targets.
Great. What about you, Barbara?
I think this is an area where compliance officers really get to shine and show their worth, because over time, we've always had to be agile. We've always had to respond to rapidly changing external, whether it's regulatory or circumstances or the economy, whatever it is. And we're already operating in this rapidly changing environment where we have to react, and we have to prove that we can do that and make it practical and make our our function be as useful as we can be to the business and to the employees. So just, yeah, staying agile.
Barbara, I couldn't agree more. What a nice positioning for us as a profession. I think we do have a responsibility here and an opportunity to be answering those questions and calming those insecurities for our employees, whatever they might be, because we've done this many times. There's been many changes of administration, many changes in rules, many changes in enforcement focus. And I think we will be the people that our employees would turn to answer those questions and certainly prepare, whether it's for M&A or just more generally prepare our companies and our business partners to move forward with ease and peace of mind. So I love that. And I love the word you use, shine. It is an opportunity to shine. Both of you are shiners. I really appreciate what you've been able to do for us and sharing your tips. If I may, I hate to draw this to a close, but may I just ask you if you've got any parting tips for our listeners when it comes to navigating acquisitions and M&A in the current environment? I'll start with you, Barbara.
Most importantly, I would say is don't forget that the people who may be coming over from an acquired organization are going to have a level of stress. There's some fear and uncertainty. And so treat them with respect. Focus on that you're going to have one unified organization, and at all costs, avoid that us versus them mentality.
Barbara, that's so important. And you remind me, actually, when I've been through these, sometimes just the very language we use, like still referring them to as a different company name or a different entity, can be very damaging. You have to think about that unified approach. So I love that. I love that. Alison, over to you for your parting thoughts.
All right. No, Barbara, I love that too. Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of what we talked about today was that this can be a challenge, right? It's multifaceted. So I would just say, when you're thinking about acquiring companies, you're thinking about M&A, think about being involved early, right? Help and really understanding the culture of the company you're acquiring, right? Around the people. And then looking at those red flags, but maybe also those that are less red, right? More of those subtle flags, and helping to just, but while you're looking at what you're going to be, taking with these new companies, be adaptable, look at the regulatory environment. It's going to keep changing. And when you take all of that and put all of that together, I think it allows you to build that more resilient compliance program that can help mitigate the risks right at hand, but also prepare you for that longer term strategic success.
I love that. Again, shine in your role, setting your companies up for strategic success. I love that. So as always, I wanted to thank you both, Barbara, Allison, for joining us. Ellen, thank you for joining as a co-host today. We want to thank you for your insights. I also want to thank our listeners for turning up and listening every time. We want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Corporate Compliance Insights, which makes this podcast possible. And if this discussion inspired you, please share it with someone. Take advantage of our LinkedIn group, our Quick Link LinkedIn group, and to learn more about these topics or any others that interest you. And we'll be back next week with another episode. But for now, thank you so much for joining us.